Hey. Welcome back to Say It Forward with Lou. I'm your girl, Lynda, aka Lou, and we are a community of healing, growth, creativity, positivity, and faith. So let's sift through the shift of today's conversation and chat. Now, y'all, today's episode, well, this one is personal, as I say with probably most of them, right? But because we're talking about perspective, right? And if we're honest, perspective isn't just how you see things, right? Perspective is the story you tell yourself about what you see. And if that story has been shaped by pain, then you can misinterpret everything, right? You'll misinterpret delays. You'll misinterpret closed doors, right? You'll misinterpret waiting seasons. You'll even misinterpret yourself sometimes, right? And before you know it, the mirror, right, isn't reflecting reality anymore. It's reflecting what? Wounds, right? Because sometimes the mirror shows the makeup, right? But not the miracle. Sometimes the mirror shows the scars, right? But not the survival, right? Sometimes the mirror shows the circumstance, but it doesn't show the calling. And that's what I want to talk about today, right? Because there was a season in my life when the mirror lied to me, right? And not like necessarily like a physical mirror, right? But the internal one, right? The mirror of perspective. And let me tell you, it had me believing things about myself that God never said. So let's talk. So there was a season where every time I looked in the mirror, I saw what I lost, right? I saw what didn't work. I saw who left. I saw what ended. I saw everything that wasn't happening. And I saw every unanswered prayer, right? I saw every disappointment. I saw every delay, right? And what made it worse, people around me often saw something completely different. You know what I mean? People saw strength, they saw faith, they saw resilience, some saw purpose, some saw wisdom, right? But internally, I was struggling with the story that I was telling myself. And here's what I've come to realize. The mirror wasn't the problem, okay? The lens was, right? Because perspective is powerful, right? Perspective can take preparation in a season and call it punishment, right? Perspective can take waiting in a season and call it rejection, right? Perspective can take transition and call it failure, right? Perspective can take pruning and call it abandonment. We're going to go one more. Perspective can take a wilderness season and completely miss the fact that God is still present, right? And honestly, there was a season when the mirror wasn't reflecting one loss, right? It was reflecting all of them, right? All the losses. It was the marriage, miscarriages, infertility journey, the hysterectomy later on, the waiting, right? The disappointments I never saw coming, the dreams that didn't unfold the way I had imagined, right? The seasons where I felt unseen. And the seasons where I felt forgotten. Let's just be real about that. There were seasons where I wondered if I had somehow missed God completely. And before I knew it, I wasn't just grieving what happened, right? I was allowing what happened to tell me who I was. And that's where the danger is, right? Because pain is a terrible narrator. I'll say it again. Pain is a terrible narrator because pain will start telling a story that God never wrote, right? Pain will start interpreting your life for you, right? Pain will tell you you're behind and you're forgotten and you're unwanted and you're too damaged, right? You missed your moment. You missed your opportunity, right? You missed your chance. You're too old, right? My 50-year-old self. You're too old, right? You're too late. You're not enough. all the things, right? And the scary thing is when pain becomes the narrator, the story can sound believable because it's rooted in real experiences, right? It's rooted in real heartbreak. It's rooted in real grief. It's rooted in real disappointment and real loss. But just because it happened doesn't mean it defines you, right? And so for me, the mirror said, you're behind. But God was saying, no, Lou, you're being prepared, right? The mirror said, you're unwanted. But God said, no, baby, you're chosen. The mirror said, girl, you missed it. God said, I'm still writing it. The mirror said, Lou, you've forgotten. Like, go on now, right? But God said, before I formed you, I knew you, right? And maybe that's where some of us, like me, are today, right? Not struggling with what happened, but struggling with what we've allowed it to mean. Because perspective is the story we tell ourselves about what we see. And if we don't allow God to correct our lens, we'll keep believing a version of ourselves that heaven never agreed with, right? And that's exactly why I really like the story we're about to talk about, because there was another woman who found herself believing the wrong story too. So let's get into it. Let's go to Genesis 16, Hagar. If there was ever a woman who had a reason to feel unseen, Hagar, right? She wasn't the chosen wife. She wasn't the celebrated one, right? She wasn't the favored one, right? She wasn't the one the promise was spoken over, right? She was caught in the middle of someone else's story, mistreated, misunderstood, rejected, right? And eventually she ran. And can we just pause there? Because some of us know exactly what that feels like, right? And not necessarily physically running. Some of you run as you're a track star, right? Some of you are physically running, but emotionally running and spiritually running, right? Mentally running, right? Trying to escape pain, trying to escape disappointment, and trying to escape what feels unbearable in the moment, right? That's real. And that's where Hagar found herself in the wilderness, pregnant, afraid, alone, abandoned. Or at least that's what it looked like, right? But perspective will make you believe you're abandoned when God is actually meeting you. And right there in the wilderness, right? God shows up, not after she gets herself together, right? Not after she figures it out, not after she becomes stronger, right? Right there in the middle of the mess, God meets her. And what I love is that God doesn't just give her instructions, right? He gives her identity. Because sometimes before God changes your circumstances, right? He changes how you see yourself, right? And Hagar says something so powerful, right? And if you know the story, she says, you are the God who sees me, El Roy, the God who sees me, right? Not the God who saw me after I got it together, not the God who saw me after I succeeded, right? Not the God who saw me after I healed, but the God who sees me right here, right now, in this moment. And maybe that's what the word for somebody listening or watching today is. God sees you. He sees you in the waiting. He sees you in the grief. He sees you in the transition. God sees you in your confusion. He sees you in your wilderness. Okay? He sees you because purpose doesn't start with visibility. Purpose starts with perspective. And the moment Hagar realized she was seen, everything changed, right? And if Hagar teaches us that God sees us, then the Samaritan woman is about to teach us what happens when God changes how we see ourselves. So let's talk about it. So let's look at another woman in John 4, the Samaritan woman. And baby, if we're not careful, we'll miss the real miracle in this story, right? Because most of us who know the story, we focus on the water, right? But I think the story is really about perspective, right? Now, the Bible says she came to the well in the heat of the day, right? The hottest time of the day. She was alone. And culturally, that's significant in that time because most women gathered water together, but she came by herself. And many theologians believe she came alone because of shame, right? Because of judgment, because of her reputation, right? And because she didn't want to deal with the whispers, right? And the chatter, right? The stares, the assumptions, right? And if we're honest, and if I'm honest, right, a lot of us know what it's like to carry invisible things, right? Things nobody can physically see, but we feel them every day, right? The grief, right? The disappointment, the heartbreak, the rejection, right? The unanswered prayers, right? The things we don't talk about, right? Whatever it is, right? The things we smile through, right? I know I've done that, right? The things that we carry quietly, right? We don't talk about those things. And so here this woman comes, right? Carrying her water jar, right? And she wasn't just carrying the water jar though, right? Not really. Like her water jar was simply the visible thing. That's what we could see, right? But she was carrying years of disappointment and relationship history and labels, right? And shame and other people's opinion, right? And stories had been told about her. And perhaps most dangerously, stories she had started believing about herself, right? And then she encounters Jesus. So watch this, right? So at first, she doesn't see him clearly, right? She sees him as a stranger, right? She sees him as a Jew, right? She was a Samaritan woman. But then she sees him as a prophet as the story goes on. And eventually, and I'm condensing it, she sees him as Messiah. So do you see the progression, right? Her perspective was changing. And sometimes that's exactly what God is doing in us. Before he changes our circumstances, he changes our perspective, right? Before he changes the season, he changes the lens, right? Before he changes what's happening around us, he changes what's happening within us, right? And what I love is that Jesus never starts with condemnation, right? He started with invitation, right? He offers her living water, not temporary water, not water that satisfies for the moment, but living water. He is the living water, right? The kind that reaches deeper, right? The kind that transforms, the kind that heals, and the kind that restores, and the kind that changes you from the inside out, right? And then something happens. The Bible says she left her water jar. So think about that, y'all. She left it. The very thing she came carrying, she left behind. The water jar stayed, but the woman changed, right? The water jar stayed, but the woman changed because after an encounter with Jesus, the thing she thought she needed wasn't what she needed anymore, right? And I wonder today, how many of us are still carrying things God never asked us to keep carrying, right? Our own jars filled with old labels and old disappointments and old heartbreaks and old insecurities and old versions of ourselves, right? Water jars full of stories God never wrote. And maybe that's why this story has been sitting with me the way it has been, right? Because when I think about the Samaritan woman leaving her water jar behind, I can't help but think about everything that it represented, right? Not just water. It represented history and pain and disappointment and survival and identity, right? The story she had been carrying about herself every day, right? And y'all, I saw this visual once that I think perfectly describes what I feel healing with God looks like, at least, with me. And there was a glass filled with like dirty water, right? And at first glance, it didn't even look that bad, right? Because most of the dirt had settled toward the bottom, right? And honestly, I think that's how a lot of us live, right? We learn how to function, right? We learn how to work and smile and achieve and show up, right? We learn to carry everybody else's burdens, right? To be strong, be dependable, right? Be resilient, all the things. And because we're functioning and doing it well, we assume we're healed. And we tell ourselves, I dealt with that. I'm over that. Girl, I don't move past that. I'm good. I'm good. Right? I know I've done it. But sometimes the dirt just settled. Right? And so in the visual, clean water started being poured into the glass slowly, steadily. And as the clean water kept flowing, everything that had settled to the bottom started rising to the surface, right? And that's what sitting with God has felt like for me lately. Not because I'm broken, not because I'm going backwards, not because I'm not healed, right? But because healing happens in layers. And when you finally get still with God, when you stop performing strength, and when you stop distracting yourself, and when you stop rushing and you stop numbing, things start rising. Old grief rises, old fear rises, old disappointments rise, old insecurities rise, old wounds rise, not because healing isn't happening, but because healing is happening, right? Because what blessed me about that visual, right, was this. The dirt rising to the surface wasn't proof the water wasn't working, right? It was proof the water was working, right? God was working because as more clean water continued pouring in, eventually the dirt overflowed out the glass, and little by little, what remained fresh water, living water, right? And maybe that's exactly what Jesus was offering the Samaritan woman, right? Not just water, right? Not just relief, right? Not just comfort, right? But a new perspective, a new identity, a new story. Because after that encounter, the water jar stayed. The woman changed. And maybe God is asking us today, what are you still carrying that you are finally ready to leave behind? Because before God corrected my purpose, before he corrected my path, right? Before he clarified my next step, he had to correct my perspective, my lens, right? And the moment my perspective changed, it wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a mountaintop experience, right? I'm looking up and all. No, I'm looking down. No, it was quiet. And it happened in the stillness after heartbreak, right? It happened in the stillness after disappointment, in the moments where there was nobody left to impress or try to, right? Nobody left to perform for, nobody left to convince, just me and God. And God whispered something that changed everything for me. You are looking at yourself through wounds, not the word. And when he said that, I knew exactly what he meant because pain had become the narrator, right? And the moment my perspective changed, right? Pain became the narrator, right? Pain had started interpreting my life, right? Pain was assigning meaning to things God never intended. Pain was telling me who I was. And that's dangerous, right? Because pain is a terrible narrator. Pain will start telling a story God never wrote, right? Because pain said the marriage ended, right? God said, I still have purpose for you. Pain said, The dream didn't happen the way you imagined. God said, my plans for you are still good, right? Pain said, you're too late. God said, I make all things beautiful in their time, right? Pain was telling me, girl, you're forgotten. God said, I've had you in mind from the beginning. Pain said, you're damaged. God said, you're mine. And when I tell you, that's why this episode matters so much, because many of us aren't struggling with our circumstances as much as we're struggling with the meaning we've assigned to them, right? Because we aren't just carrying experiences, right? We're carrying interpretations, right? And some of those interpretations need to be surrendered. Some of those stories need to be rewritten. Some of those narratives need to be challenged, right? Because not every thought you've had about yourself came from God. Some of the thoughts came from what? Disappointment. Some came from rejection. Some came from fear, right? Some came from comparison, right? Some came from grief. Some came from people who were hurting themselves. And again, if we're not careful, we'll keep believing those stories long after God has been trying to tell us a different one, right? Because changing your life doesn't always start with changing your circumstances, yes, right? But sometimes it starts with, again, changing your lens. Because if you don't fix how you see your perspective, right, you'll keep mislabeling what God is doing. And you'll call preparation punishment, right? You'll call pruning rejection, right? You'll call waiting abandonment. You'll call transition failure, right? And you'll miss God while He's working. And that's why perspective is one of the things God corrected in me before purpose, before preparation, and before the next assignment. He had to deal with how I was seeing, right? And so honestly, I think that's why perspective is one of my 5 P's in my framework, right? 5 pillars. And not because it's most popular and not because it's the easiest, but because it's very foundational, right? Because perspective can determine everything, right? Perspective determines whether you spiral or whether you surrender, right? How you see things. Perspective can determine whether you see a setback or if you see preparation. Perspective can determine whether you see a closed door or divine protection, right? Perspective can determine whether you interpret a season as punishment or a season of pruning, right? And it can determine whether you trust God more or trust your fears, right? Because before God changes your life, He often changes how you see your life, right? Hagar's circumstances didn't immediately change, right? But her perspective did, right? You are the God who sees me, right? The Samaritan woman's circumstances didn't immediately change, but her perspective did, right? And once their perspective changed, everything else started moving differently, right? And maybe that's an invitation for us today. Not necessarily to ask God to change our circumstances first, right? But to ask Him to change our lens, right? To show us what He's seeing, to help us interpret this season correctly and to help us see ourselves correctly, to help us see Him correctly, right? Yeah, because when perspective shifts, purpose becomes clearer, right? Preparation becomes a bit easier. Perseverance becomes possible, right? And the path forward starts to become visible, right? And so let me speak directly to the woman listening and watching today, the woman who has been measuring herself by what happened, the woman who has been letting pain narrate her story, right? The woman who has been carrying a water jar God never asked her to keep carrying. The woman who has been believing the mirror instead of believing God. Hear me. You are not broken. You are not the broken reflection you've been studying. You are not your disappointment. You are not your delay. You are not your rejection, right? You're not your divorce. You're not your diagnosis. You're not your mistakes, right? You're not what happened to you. You are who God says you are. You are seen. Ask Hagar, right? You are known. Ask the Samaritan woman, right? You are loved. You are chosen and you are called. And you're being prepared. You're being refined. You're being strengthened. You're being healed, right? And some of you need to hear this today, right? The mirror has had the microphone too long enough. It's time to let God tell the story because God's version of your story is so much better than the one fear has been telling, right? His version is better than shame's version. His version is better than rejection's version, right? His version is better than your wounds version. I like that, right? So today, I dare to challenge the narrator, challenge every lie, challenge every label, challenge every story that doesn't sound like your father, and ask yourself, what has my mirror been telling me that God never said, right? So if this episode has resonated with you in any way, if you realize that your perspective has been shaped more by pain than God's promise, more by wounds than God's word, right? Then I want to invite you to take the next step because sometimes we need help identifying the stories we've been carrying, right? Sometimes we need help recognizing the jars we never put down, right? And sometimes we need someone to walk alongside us as we learn to see differently. And that's exactly what I do, right? With my coaching, that's exactly what I do. So if you're ready to reclaim your perspective and clarify your purpose and move forward with intention, I invite you to book a chit chat clarity call with me. It's a free call to see if we can partner together in coaching. And you can visit sayitforwardwithlou.com. And let's talk about what your mirror has been telling you. And let's compare it to what God is actually saying, right? Because when your perspective shifts, everything begins to shift. So thank you for spending this time with me today. And remember, the mirror may show you what happened, but only God can tell you what it means, right? Don't let pain narrate a story God never wrote. Drink deeply from the living water and leave the water jar behind and move forward knowing this. The water jar stayed, but the woman changed. So until next time, keep healing, keep growing, keep trusting. I love y'all. And as always, stay tuned, stay a while, and let's continue to say it forward together. Take care.